Hello, and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, John Harney. Today I want to talk about Iron Harvest from King Art Games. I mentioned this game in a shout-out in our recent Game of the Year podcast, which I strongly recommend, by the way. There's a link in the description. I wanted to share some footage with you and talk a little bit more about why I like this game and the things I think it does well. The game appeals to me beyond the gameplay itself in two ways. The first of those is its status as a kind of meta-historical object. Now, what I mean by that is that Iron Harvest is a real-time strategy game, an RTS, and it's a nuts and bolts, dyed-in-the-wool RTS. This is not a tribute to RTS games of days gone by or an interpretation of the RTS. This is it. This is the real 1998 deal. In the 1990s, the RTS reigned supreme, certainly in PC gaming, and it remained fairly healthy and viable into the 2000s. And what we get here is a game that really decided to take the best things about, for example, Warcraft 3, or perhaps a bit more directly, the original Company of Heroes, and built upon them further. Now listen, because I know there have been a lot of RTS games released in the last 20 years, I know. But something about Iron Harvest just feels really retro, like purposefully, deliberately retro. 2020 kept up a pretty hard-charging pace when it came to video game remasters and re-releases and the like, but there's something about the way Iron Harvest successfully marries modern quality-of-life video game practices with a very old-school feel that particularly tickles me. There's a lot of game here too, between a campaign, challenges, skirmish mode and multiplayer. If you, like me, played quite a few RTS games once upon a time, or if you don't know much about the genre but would like to get into it, this game is definitely worth a look. On top of all that, Iron Harvest is a game that sometimes feels like an historical artifact, or one shaped by a keen sense of the genre's history. Like, they came into this game wanting to make this very old-school feeling RTS, and I just think that's really interesting. Bob and I have joked a bit on recent podcasts about feeling old. I certainly joke about feeling old, but when I was playing these games in the 1990s, it never occurred to me they would be, they'd be the history of the medium in the, what now feels like not too distant future. But, here we are. Now, as for the game's historical setting, or I suppose I should say its alt-historical setting, Iron Harvest is set in the 1920-plus fictional universe, an alternate history to ours set shortly after the end of the Great War. This setting, the brainchild of Polish artist Jakub Rosowski, imagines a steampunk-driven conflict between Polania and the far more powerful Rusviet, based on a Russian empire that never fell to communism. Meanwhile, on its western flank, you have Saxony, which again is effectively a Kaiser-led or similar to Kaiser-led German imperial state that survived the Great War. We are talking the immediate wake of World War I here. This is not a game operating as a kind of World War II prequel. The 1920-plus world, despite the hulking, steam-leaking mechs, is a product of the kind of great power colonialism and European power dynamics that ultimately led to the Great War in the first place. Polania finds itself in a similar position to Poland at this moment, on the doorstep of a massive, ambitious, dynastic power to the east, the Rusviet, or Russians in our timeline, in our world, and a dynamic and aggressive imperial state to the west, Saxony or the Germans. The game's single-player campaign ultimately gives you a chance to control troops and mechs from all three factions. And though I will try not to spoil too much, the story dwells more on the importance of human connections than state rivalries. While saying that, the game seems to be at least a little sympathetic towards the cause of the Polania faction. In fact, especially early on, the game offers a narrative position that we have not seen too much of yet in video games. A Central European experience of the European theatres of both World Wars. Polania is very clearly the weakest of the three factions featured in the game. Its largely rural and apparently peaceful citizenry are at serious risk of being overrun by either or both of its aggressive neighbours. All of this adds up to the kind of underdog story we're used to seeing in games. But of course, from my perspective, this has the added benefit of being true. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact devoured Poland in 1939, its land taken by Russians on one side and Nazi Germans on the other. And not for the first time in Polish history. Iron Harvest separates us from the infamy of these events, not to mention the horrors of the Holocaust, not just in its alternate history setting, but in its chronological placement in the wake of the Great War. If anything, it feels like the Great War never ended, and Polania has to try and survive with, giant diesel-powered mechs. It's a good time, I won't lie. It's a great setting, and though King Art Games deserve credit for committing to it, it's worth pointing out that the 1920 Plus universe is quite extensive in its own right. If this appeals to you, you should also check out Scythe, a board game set in this universe that also has a digital version, which is quite nice. It's a very kind of authentic board game experience, complete with little kind of painted pieces and the kind of board game rules your friend spends the first 30 minutes of Friday night explaining to you before you get stuck in. But once you do, it's quite a lot of fun. Mostly I really enjoyed sending large mechs across the countryside as part of scattered battles between riflemen that still felt like a World War I game somehow. Just dwelling on that particular period, a kind of very end of World War I, very beginning of the interwar period, it was just immediately refreshing. It was a real change compared to so many games I play. I'd really encourage you to have a look at this one. Thank you for watching History Respawned. Come check us out at www.historyrespond.com, where you can also listen to our podcast episodes. And if you would like to support this work, please consider visiting us at patreon.com/historyrespawned. Thanks for watching.